In a small town called Blackwater in North Carolina, there was an abandoned cemetery known as Shadow Hill. This cemetery had been surrounded by legends for over a century, with stories claiming that anyone who entered after midnight never returned, or if they did, they came back different. The locals avoided talking about it, and if asked, they whispered about entire families disappearing in the past after visiting it at night. On a dark October night, 5 college friends decided to explore the cemetery as a Halloween dare. They were armed with video cameras and flashlights, determined to capture anything unusual. They arrived at the cemetery around 11 at night, and the air was unnaturally cold, with thick fog enveloping the tall trees surrounding the graveyard. As they entered, they noticed the air felt heavy, as if something was watching them. They wandered among the tombstones, reading the names carved into the worn-out stones. Suddenly, they heard light footsteps behind them. They turned around but saw nothing. They continued forward, but the sounds grew louder as if someone or something was following them. Within minutes, the cameras started malfunctioning. The footage turned blurry, and a strange buzzing noise emerged. Suddenly, all the flashlights went out at the same time, leaving the group in total darkness. They tried turning them back on, but they wouldn't work. At that moment, a faint moan came from a nearby grave. The sound grew louder as if it was coming from beneath the ground. One of the friends, named Mike, approached the grave to find that the stone was broken as if something had emerged from it. Suddenly, he felt an icy hand grip his ankle and pull him forcefully towards the grave. Mike screamed for help as his friends tried to grab him, but whatever was pulling him was stronger than anything they could resist. In the end, Mike vanished into the darkness, leaving no trace behind. The remaining friends ran towards the car, but soon realized they were running in circles around the cemetery, as if something was preventing them from leaving. Suddenly, tall, shadowy figures appeared before them, moving slowly in their direction. Their faces were unclear, but the group felt an unbearable chill piercing through their bodies. One of the friends, named Sarah, began hearing whispers in her ears, urging her to stay. She tried to resist the voice, but she felt an eerie attraction toward one of the graves. Suddenly, she collapsed to the ground and started speaking in an unknown language. Her friends tried to help her, but she was unnaturally strong and pushed them away. In the end, 3 of them managed to escape, while Sarah vanished completely, just like Mike. When they returned with the police in the morning, there was no trace of them, nor were the cameras found. However, a week later, a strange video appeared on an anonymous YouTube channel. The footage showed Mike and Sarah standing in the cemetery, staring directly into the camera while shadows moved behind them. The last thing in the video was a horrifying scream before the feed cut off. Since that day, Shadow Hill Cemetery became a forbidden place, even to the authorities, and it is said that anyone who visits at night can hear whispers urging them to stay forever. My name is Thomas Grayson, and for the past 15 years, I have been the caretaker of Blackwood Cemetery. It's a lonely job, one that most people wouldn't even consider, but for me it was a quiet escape from a world I never quite fit into. I had no wife, no kids, and barely any friends. The dead, at least, never judged me. Blackwood Cemetery was old, older than the town itself, some folks claimed. The graves stretched back to the early 1800s, their stones weathered and cracked, the names barely legible. It was the kind of place that had stories whispered about it, the kind of place that kept kids up at night, daring each other to sneak past its rusted gates. At first, I never paid much attention to the rumors. People love to make up ghost stories, especially about places like this. Shadows moving between headstones, whispers on the wind, the feeling of being watched. I'd heard it all before. I dismissed it as overactive imaginations, tricks of the mind. But then, things started happening. Things I couldn't explain. It began with the bells. Many of the older graves had little bells attached to them. A practice from centuries ago when people feared being buried alive. A string ran from the coffin up to the surface, connected to a bell, so that if someone woke up underground, they could ring for help. Of course, those bells hadn't chimed in over 100 years, until one night they did. I was making my rounds just past midnight, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick fog that always seemed to settle over Blackwood. That's when I heard it. A faint, delicate ringing like a whisper against the silence. I froze, my breath hitching. The sound came again from the older section of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay forgotten beneath vines and neglect. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal brushing against one of the rusted wires. But as I approached, my heart hammering in my chest, I saw it. The bell hanging above one of the oldest graves was swaying back and forth, its chime clear and deliberate. The name on the grave was unreadable, the stone worn smooth by time, but the bell was ringing. In a small town called Black Hollow, there was an old cemetery known as the Monks' Cemetery. It sat atop a desolate hill surrounded by twisted trees that reached toward the sky like skeletal hands. The townspeople avoided it, not just because of its eerie atmosphere, but because of the most terrifying legend of all. Grave number 13. According to the stories, this grave was no ordinary burial site. It was said to be a gateway to the spirit world. Those who dared to approach it would hear whispers from the past, voices that warned and threatened, but no one had ever tried to uncover the truth. Until now. Amy, a university student fascinated by biology and the supernatural, was determined to prove that these legends were nothing more than exaggerated myths. Accompanying her were her two friends, Carl and Laura, horror enthusiasts and amateur filmmakers eager to document the adventure for their YouTube channel. Their plan was simple: visit grave number 13 at night and record everything. At midnight they sneaked into the cemetery. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Everything felt wrong, as if the ground itself rejected their presence. The leafless trees swayed despite the stillness of the wind, their branches whispering in hushed tones. "It's just our imagination. Our minds are playing tricks on us," Amy muttered, trying to keep calm. But as they approached grave number 13, they noticed something strange. Unlike the other graves, its headstone was broken and the soil looked recently disturbed. At its edge, a peculiar symbol was carved into the stone, a tangled circle with thorn-like edges, as if sealing something inside. Carl, the most reckless of the group, grinned and said, "Well, let's open it up and see what's inside." As soon as they began digging, the air around them turned unnaturally cold. A faint sound like slow, heavy breathing rose from beneath the ground. Despite the unease creeping up their spines, they kept going until they unearthed an old wooden coffin covered in strange carvings. With trembling hands, Carl pried it open. Inside lay the body of a monk dressed in black robes. But what horrified them most was that his features were untouched by decay. He looked as if he had been buried just yesterday, his closed eyes giving the unsettling impression that he was watching them. Then, before any of them could react, the monk's mouth slowly opened, and from within came a hoarse whisper. "You have disturbed me." They jumped back, their terror mounting. But before they could flee, the coffin began to tremble violently. Then, as if the entire world had shifted, the cemetery gate slammed shut with an ear-splitting clang, and the graves around them started to shake, as if something beneath was struggling to rise. Laura screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the suffocating air. And then the monk stood behind them. His skin was deathly pale, his eyes entirely black. In a voice that rumbled like a distant storm, he said, "You have disturbed me, and now you will pay the price." The ground beneath them cracked open like a gaping maw, revealing an abyss of swirling darkness. They ran in different directions, but the cemetery had changed. It was no longer a familiar space, but an endless maze of shifting tombstones and shadowy corridors. Carl stumbled and fell, and when they turned to help him, he was gone. Laura trembled, reaching for Amy, but before she could grasp her, a pair of blackened hands emerged from the darkness and pulled her away without a single sound. Amy was the only one left. Desperately, she ran toward the gate, only to find it sealed shut with an old rusted lock. Above it, an inscription was etched into the stone. "Those who unseal the grave shall not leave without sacrifice." Then she heard it, a whisper behind her. The monk was there, approaching slowly. "You are the last one left." In a frantic attempt to survive, Amy's eyes darted around until she spotted a small stone engraved with the same strange symbol from the grave. Without thinking, she grabbed it and hurled it at the monk. A piercing scream tore through the night, and then nothing but darkness. At dawn, Amy was found just outside the cemetery gates, sitting on the cold ground, staring blankly into space. She whispered unintelligible words, as if speaking to someone only she could see. When questioned, she remembered nothing of what had happened. As for Carl and Laura, they were never found. But after that night, the townspeople noticed something strange. Anyone who wandered too close to grave number 13 would hear faint, ghostly whispers, and sometimes a voice that was all too familiar. You have disturbed me. I never wanted this job, but desperation drives people to strange places. Oakwood Cemetery was old and forgotten, stretching over a desolate patch of land just outside town. The work wasn't complicated: digging graves, keeping the grounds clean, and locking the gates at night. The pay barely covered my expenses, but the solitude made it bearable. Or so I thought. The town had its fair share of stories about the place, whispers of strange occurrences buried under decades of neglect. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts, but I didn't have the luxury of being picky. The first few nights were uneventful, though the air carried an odd weight, like something unseen was watching me. Occasionally, I would hear a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy across the dirt. It always came from the oldest part of the cemetery, where the headstones were so worn that the names had faded away. I told myself it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but deep down I knew better. Something here never found rest. One night I stayed late digging a new grave near the tree line. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with deep crimson. As I wiped the sweat from my brow, I heard it again. Closer this time. A slow, deliberate scraping, like something clawing at wood. I gripped my shovel tightly and turned toward the sound. In the dim twilight, I saw a shadow moving between the graves, slipping behind a tilted headstone. I froze for a moment, then forced myself to step forward. Hello? My voice felt unnaturally loud in the silence. No response, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I took another step, and the ground beneath me shifted. I slipped, landing hard on my knees as a small opening appeared in the soil. It wasn't just loose dirt, it was as if the earth had swallowed itself. And beneath it, there was a coffin. It was old, its wood cracked and splintered. The lid was slightly ajar, revealing a pitch-black void inside. But the worst part wasn't that. The inside of the lid was covered in scratches, deep grooves, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. A wave of rot and decay hit me, making my stomach lurch. I backed away slowly, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. But nothing made sense. This grave had been sealed for decades. So why did it look like something had moved inside it, recently? I didn't sleep that night, and by morning I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined it all, that the wood had simply deteriorated over time and the ground had collapsed naturally. But when I returned to the cemetery, I stopped dead in my tracks. The hole was gone, completely filled in. The earth above it was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. I dropped to my knees, running my hands over the soil, my breath shallow. There were no signs of digging, no trace of my shovel. It was as if the grave had closed itself. Overnight. I searched the records, desperate for answers. The grave belonged to Richard Holloway, buried in 1908, but what disturbed me were the notes left by the caretakers before me. Soil disturbance. Coffin found open. Do not dig this grave. A chill ran through me. This wasn't just some old legend. Since humans began walking the earth, we have needed a place to commemorate our dead. Whether it was the sky burials of some Native American tribes or the fire burial rituals of the Vikings, humanity has developed a series of complex customs to cope with the loss of loved ones. Not only that, but we have also needed a place to remember them. The modern age has brought us the burial and marker system that we often call cemeteries or graveyards. These places are shrouded in a deep sense of human mortality, places of profound reverence. One might even go so far as to call them outright sacred. Few people find any real comfort in such places, and their natural association with death has made them a focal point of horror fiction throughout history. So, quite frankly, I can think of no worse place to meet a gruesome end. The horrific irony of dying in a cemetery is a fate that very few of us will ever have to endure. However, for this unfortunate girl, That was exactly the cruel fate she met. This was the tragic end of Megan Holmes, a 16-year-old girl from Seattle, Washington. Megan was an exemplary student and a joy to be around, according to her friends. She was an honor student due to her dedication to her studies and a cheerleader thanks to her passion for extracurricular activities. However, as she advanced into her teenage years, her behavior began to change, not just in the innocent, rebellious way that most young people exhibit, but in a reckless, self-destructive, and worryingly wild manner. She quickly abandoned her cheerleading team, stopped spending time with her usual friends, and her teachers noticed her waning attention in class, which resulted in her grades plummeting. After much deliberation, her parents concluded that the change in her behavior was due to her relationship with a young man named Eric Collins, a 19-year-old from the city's suburbs. There was little doubt that Eric was a bad influence on Megan. He introduced her to smoking and alcohol, things she had previously avoided her entire life. The pair regularly stayed out late, attending rock concerts and loitering around dive bars until they were kicked out for lacking proper ID. As time went on, her parents despaired over their daughter's increasingly rebellious ways. They tried and failed to find a solution to steer her back onto the right path. In the end, they decided to take drastic action and placed her, very much against her will, in a rehabilitation center for troubled teens on February 12, 1994. However, Megan had no intention of staying there, and she began plotting her escape from the moment she arrived. On one cold February night, she waited for the right moment. When the staff members turned their backs, she slipped out of the secure building with only a bag containing a few meager belongings. Her parents were furious with those responsible for her care, enraged that they had been negligent enough to allow her to escape. They immediately contacted the Seattle police, filing a missing persons report, and she was classified as an at-risk teenager. Police contacted Eric Collins, her former boyfriend, who lived hundreds of miles away, suspecting that Megan might attempt to reach him. However, when they arrived, they found that not only was Megan not there, but Eric had been completely unaware of her escape attempt. It was only then that the authorities realized how grave the situation truly was. Tragically, after being missing for just 2 days, Megan Holmes' lifeless body was discovered at the rear of Hillside Cemetery, more than 25 miles from the rehabilitation center. She had been assaulted, stripped, and brutally beaten. She was still wearing her ring, but in a chilling detail, the pendant she always wore, inscribed with the word "Hope," was missing. At first, Eric Collins was the prime suspect, but early DNA testing technology proved his innocence. The police theorized that Megan had tried to hitchhike to the city, and when a car stopped, 2 men had offered her a ride. Either she outright refused, after sensing danger, or changed her mind during the ride, becoming suspicious of their intentions. Whatever the case, a terrifying chase ensued, and Megan tried to escape by running into the cemetery. Evidence showed that she had attempted to hide behind gravestones. One of her socks was found nearby, and a muddy footprint was discovered behind a headstone. However, her pursuers ultimately caught up with her. On May 3, 2010, after 16 years of investigation, police in Portland, Oregon arrested a man named Martin Lewis King after his DNA matched the samples found at the crime scene. In court, Martin confessed that he had assaulted and murdered Megan. He revealed that he chased her until she collided with a fence and fell, then brutally beat her to death with a tombstone. Police confirmed his story after they discovered bloodied fragments of a gravestone near the crime scene. In exchange for his confession, Martin avoided the death penalty and was sentenced to 35 years to life in prison. We can only imagine the final terrifying moments of Megan Holmes' life, fatally pursued in a place where the concept of death is ever present, only to be beaten to death with something that symbolizes our very mortality. It seems the Grim Reaper has a sick sense of humor.